We don't really have very many dictatorships anymore. There's no Hitler, there's no Stalin, there's no Mao. There's no Baby Doc and Papa Doc. There's no Batista. There is still Castro, but not much. Antonescu, Ceausescu, Pilsudski, Dollfuss. I have a list of about 75 dictators on this sheet of paper who are just from the 20th century. So those regimes are mostly gone. And this has been a big problem of interpretation. How do you understand a regime that doesn't have a dictator? And we've been using vocabulary like, for example, semi-democracy, kind of a democracy, electoral democracy, ought to be a democracy. There's a whole vocabulary, a normative vocabulary of democratization to characterize the world's regimes. Because they're no longer dictatorships. I mean, obviously, they're not Mao, it's not Stalin, right? And yet, what are they? For about 20 years, the social sciences lost their way on these questions. I've been teaching at Princeton for 23 years, and for the past 23 years, I taught the only course on authoritarianism in the social sciences at Princeton. There were several hundred courses on democracy and democratization. Graduate students came to me to write dissertations on democratization in Central Asia, for example, after the fall of the Soviet regime. Of course, I refused to get involved in such topics because I'm not in the literature department. But anyway, now there's another course besides mine on authoritarianism at Princeton, and I predict that this will now become a trend. But for about 20 years, democratization and democracy were the dominant tropes in the social sciences, and as I say, we've kind of lost our way on analyzing authoritarian regimes. There's been a revival like this, geometric, just in the past couple of years, if you are subjecting yourself to, for example, the political science journals. You would know that. And so Juan Linz, while Franco was still alive, while the regime was still in power, Franco lasted till 75, tried to make a distinction between totalitarian regimes, i.e. the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Maos, and authoritarian regimes. And it was a very important effort because Franco was something else. He wasn't a Hitler regime. There was something else there. The problem with Juan Linz's definition is it was what the Franco regime didn't have that distinguished it from the totalitarian regimes. It was mostly a negative characteristic. It wasn't the kind of thing that was easily generalizable. It didn't have a strong single party. It didn't have a strong ideology. It didn't have this and it didn't have that. Therefore, it was authoritarian. So Linz, as I say, one of the great social scientists of our epoch and tackling an important problem, which is how to characterize all those regimes that are not necessarily totalitarian but are something else. So I believe we're still with that problem today. Now, there have been many, many other efforts since Juan Linz. Juan Linz himself made other efforts. For example, he tried sultanistic regimes, which he took from Max Weber and got accused of orientalizing the problem of authoritarianism with sultanistic regimes. There's the caudillo phenomenon, which runs through the Latin American literature. And there are many other attempts to characterize these things which are non-democratic. And they're not democratizing, but they're not totalitarian. Okay, so we have this problem of how to deal with these regimes. China, Russia, Singapore, Dubai, Iran, some would even say Pakistan, I certainly would, and many others besides. Okay, so let's start out, rather than with a definition, which will just get into trouble, because I myself could rip it apart, let alone you in the audience. Let's start out with what I would call a discernible structure. So let's give the kind of overview pattern discernible structure of just about every authoritarian regime. First, reliable instruments of violence and repression. Reliable instruments of violence and repression. That's absolutely essential. You have to have motivated, well-fed thugs. They have to be ready to do various forms of dirty work, often on extremely short notice. If you don't have that, or they're incapable of rising to the call when summoned, either you don't have an authoritarian regime to begin with, or you don't have it anymore. So the FANGs, let's call that the FANGs, reliable instruments of violence and repression. Number two, you need cash flow. You have to have steady cash flow. Maybe it's the sale of hydrocarbons that you sort of extract out of the ground. Maybe it's diamonds. Or maybe you're Kyrgyzstan and you just use democracy aid to float your authoritarian regime. One of my students wrote a dissertation comparing Kazakhstan oil revenues and Kyrgyzstan democracy aid as the main sources of patronage for those authoritarian regimes. And the Kyrgyz did very well with democracy aid. They had other trouble, though. Okay, so you need cash flow. This could be anything. Counterfeiting $100 bills, counterfeiting 500 euro notes, whatever it might be. Because if you look at the budget of an authoritarian regime, it's very expensive, and it's a cash economy. You need bulletproof vests, depending on the size of your country, depending on your aspirations. For example, if you want to buy the Israeli model of bulletproof vests, the expensive model. You think AK-47s are cheap? They are. But those pistols with silencers are unbelievably expensive. You put together 10,000, 20,000 thugs. It's incredible. Between the bulletproof vests, the pistols, the silencers, the night vision goggles, what the expenses are. Add in the fact that everybody in the regime has a mistress. So you need rubies, you need emeralds, you need diamonds in big numbers, really big numbers. The import of jewels by authoritarian regimes is colossal. And you go down the budget of what an authoritarian regime looks like in practice, and it's this gigantic demand for cash. Because you're buying loyalty, you're floating that repressive apparatus, and you're buying loyalty in a cash economy. And the way you hurt an authoritarian regime is you cut the cash flow. That's the single most important policy tool available against any authoritarian regime. You cut the aorta, you cut the cash. You deny them access to the international banking system, and or you deny them their sources of foreign currency revenue. A lot of them don't have convertible currency, so they need foreign currency revenue, which is quite different. They need to have something which is saleable on world markets, unless they counterfeit the money themselves. So that's point number two. Patronage gets very expensive. Commodity prices can be extremely volatile. They're high, and then all of a sudden they're low, and you got an expensive regime, and you're broke. And you can't pay off the goons, the thugs. You can't pay anybody off. So you need a backup. Even if you're a commodity-based economy, you need a backup. Maybe you hurl a piece of garbage, a hunk of metal, into the Sea of Japan and demand a ransom, for example. That's one way to raise a lot of cash. The North Koreans have been extremely successful over the years. They take a refrigerator or a washing machine, they put a lot of tin foil around it, and it's a satellite, and then they put it on what they call a rocket, which is this hunk of metal with a flame underneath it, and then they fishtail it up into the air, and if it doesn't disintegrate yet, it then will go somewhere in the water, and it'll be a missile launch, and then there'll have to be negotiations, and they'll need $300 or $400 or $500 million. It's a great gig if you can continue to do it. So I'm serious when I say you need cash flow. cash flow like the thugs, well-motivated, well-fed thugs.